Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Beth Orton, and I'm from the Development Policy Centre. It's really great to see so many people joining us here in the Zoom today and via our Facebook page, live streaming. So this is our first day of Pacific Update and the afternoon session on food security and supply chains. Before I hand over to our chair, Vijay, I just wanted to encourage everyone to participate when the Q&A session is after each presentation. You can either add a question in the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen, or you can also raise your hand. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a reactions button. And if you click that and raise your hand, the chair will be able to direct the presenter to respond to your question. So I'm really pleased to hand over to our chair for the session this afternoon, Vijay Naidu. Thanks, Vijay.
Thank you very much, Beth. I'd like to join you in welcoming the speakers this afternoon, as well as all the other attendees. I hope we have a very useful discussion on this very important topic of food security and supply chains, especially in the context of COVID-19, and of course, in the backdrop of climate change. Food security basically is about availability of food when food is needed, and is a measure of the availability of food. And of course, supply chains relate to retailing, wholesaling, marketing, communication, and transportation linked to the supply of food. So I want to begin. We now have an understanding of how the time allocation has been made. And so I'll just move quickly to introduce the speakers. We have 4 speakers this afternoon. The first is Associate Professor Andrew MacKenzie, who is director of the Imalus campus at Vanuatu of the University of the South Pacific. He has research interests. So his research interests include land use and environmental planning and landscape architecture. Andrew will be presenting today on research that seeks to understand the extent of changes to the peri-urban landscape of Port Vila, Vanuatu. Dr. Ramona Boodoosingh is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Health Science at the National University of Samoa. And Dr. Sarah Burkhart is a senior lecturer at the Australian Centre for Pacific Islands Research, University of the Sunshine Coast. They will share their presentation and the findings of their small survey on the impact of COVID-19 on food choice in Samoa. And our final speaker is Mr. Salesh Kumar, who is Assistant Professor at the College of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry at the Fiji National University. And Salesh will be presenting a paper co-authored with Neelesh Gounder, who is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of the South Pacific, on the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on domestic agriculture supply chain in Fiji, using Singtoka Valley and the municipal market in Singtoka town as a case study. So without any further ado, it's over to Andrew.
Thank you, Vijay. I'm going to quickly turn my camera on just to prove that I exist, that I'm in North Malakula, one of our wonderful sub-centres, visiting our students up here. And unlike you poor Canberrans, it's very hot and humid. So I think I'll look a lot better with the screen off. I also have pretty remote poor access to internet. So hopefully if I turn my camera off, things will go well. So I'll just do that. And I'll just share my screen. Okay. Assuming you can all see that. So thank you very much. This is a great opportunity. I have a great affinity and affection for both ANU as an employee of USP at the moment, and welcome to all our colleagues and staff from both campuses and indeed all universities around the region. In a sense, I saw this as a great opportunity to talk about some research that I've been doing in Port Vila. And that is really in terms of looking at how the demands, or the spatial demands, of both urbanisation and the provision of space for gardening. And I started this thought process in a sense because I would essentially walk my dogs around a peri-urban settlement area for a number of years. And at the beginning of 2020, I saw a significant uptick in the number of gardeners. And that kind of made sense to me, that people would be starting to garden in the absence of other sources of income. So pursuing this line of questioning, I teamed up with some fabulous young postgraduates who've been doing some work with departments of lands in spatial high-resolution satellite imagery mapping of those areas. And I essentially came up with this question, and was to look at how these patterns of built and unbuilt spaces, and if we think about built being largely buildings, roads, other infrastructure to support accommodation and other urban services, and unbuilt spaces being essentially the landscapes which we access for the production of food and fibre and other resources on the peri-urban edge, and particularly in response to disasters. And of course, the second part of that is, well, why would I do this? Is to really find a little bit more about how these changes say something about the vulnerability of the urban edge communities in relation to cascading disasters. So what I'm looking at is how the gardeners on the rural urban fringe access these open spaces in relation to understanding the capacity of the system, essentially that peri-urban system, to adapt to more intense and frequent disasters. I was particularly interested in Susan Cutter's work on cascading disasters, looking at the integrated socio-technical aspects of disaster in relation to how systems cope. And is also particularly interested in Pelling's work, which is a little bit old now, but it's very good in looking at stresses in that context, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Had become an adaptive action that supports vulnerable communities during hardships caused by disaster, which sounds like a lovely, simple kind of question. It's like, well, do communities go out and access these landscapes and increase their gardening activity in order to cope with the loss of income or the loss of other resources? And there's also other reasons why they might do this. I might add, at the moment, this is I'm sort of midway through this project at the moment, and I've really focused on quantitative data. I haven't done any qualitative research. Hopefully that's something I might do next year. So many of you will know that Port Vila is home to 50,000, predominantly near Vanuatu. But what's really important in this context is that they're first and second generation migrant families coming from the 83 inhabited islands. And they come to Port Vila seeking jobs in tourism, retail, construction and the public service. And again, this is important because, of course, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in from a policy perspective is how governments have sought to address the issue of urban issues more generally. And at the beginning of the disaster, of the COVID pandemic, when jobs essentially evaporated, the first response was essentially to tell people to go home or go back to their islands or to their ancestral homes. And of course, many of these people many of the Vanuatu living in Port Vila, while they have an ancestral home, they don't really have a village they can return to because they're essentially, they're born and bred in Vanuatu, in Port Vila. They don't have that option. The other important thing, of course, here is that, as the growth rate of the population in Vanuatu is above 2, it's above replacement rate, as you can see, but the peri-urban areas grow at the highest rate. And despite this, and regardless of this, we run into essentially a twofold problem. One is that with the greatest rate of increase of population in these areas, you have a need for guidance, planning, regulation, some form of control, but politically 3/4 of the population live in rural areas. So the constituents aren't in the urban areas, so there's a bit of a policy vacuum and a lack of political will to address these. And interesting, as a result of that, you get poorly enforced, we get unregulated urban sprawl and the proliferation of informal settlement. And I guess this is not really surprising for most of you working in this area. Also, what's interesting is there's almost the agricultural policy really doesn't address the issues of urban agriculture for food security, despite these landscapes being the site for the production of most fresh food for Port Vila. So straight away, a food security supply chain issue here has been raised, and in fact, most recently, a WASH market house analysis has indicated there's been significant declines in well-being of farmers and market vendors in Port Vila as of the pandemic. So that's the context, that's the setting that I'm looking at. So the research method here, I really classified and quantified changes to the built and unbuilt spaces in the selected peri-urban landscapes. Essentially, one large area to the west of the city around Mele, and then to the east of the city around Tuma Valley. And what I did was to analyse the changes over different time periods defined by 2 significant disaster events. The first one being Cyclone Pam, and then the second one being the closure of the border as a response to COVID. And of course, these in isolation are quite different in terms of their impact on those particular communities. As we know, Pam was catastrophic, but then immediately following Pam, we did have a significant international aid effort, and the economy kind of rebounded quite quickly. In fact, if anything, the tourism sector and the sector that created jobs for these communities was propped up by the flood of international expertise and aid workers and the like coming in at the time. So there's kind of like a quick rebound. And of course, with the pandemic, of course, we're having a much more chronic impact, and that is that it wasn't catastrophic in the same sense of loss, but certainly in terms of loss of income and the need to shift modes of essentially sustaining yourself, and staving off extreme poverty has required people to come up with different ways to sustain themselves. So they're quite different, but in combination, we also start to think about, well, what's happening to those communities that have endured these significant events and what happened in between those times. So in part of this, just a quick, I mentioned quickly, is clearly that part of that research question was to think about adaptation. How did these communities use gardening as a form of adaptation? It's often, as I said here, it's perceived as often as a technical expert in defensive analysis of rural urban conditions rather than a socio-ecological analysis. So, adaptation is often seen about like how can the infrastructure adapt, or how does these systems support adaptation. Pelling sort of extends that to say, well, what's the adaptive potentials of these landscapes and questions? And I think that's really important when we start to think about what the cumulative effects or the cascading effects of disaster are going to be over time. But also really important to understand that there's a limit to adaptation literature when it comes to choices. And part of my research is really interested in some of the limitations to do with the role of government and others in power, including chiefs and custom landowners and land councils in relation to whether those actions constrain or dictate when and how people can act to improve their own well-being. I won't go through this table in detail, but what I'm looking at here is applying this particular peri-urban setting in terms of using Pelling's 4 stresses that cause essentially a breakdown in the socio-ecological system. And you can see that I've categorized them by built spaces and gardening. And so you can see, let's say, for example, the first one I've said here is that, lack of resources to change in built spaces, informal settlements in Port Vila are located on land that may be subject to arbitrary decisions of custom landowners. And then we can look through down to when a system is overwhelmed, a combination of natural disasters, poor regulation, and arbitrary decision-making by custom landowners result in settlements continually being built and rebuilt without lasting improvements and sustainable development outcomes. Now, I'll get to why that's important when we come to gardening, and I'll get to the pictures too, which is much more interesting. So I'm going to probably spend the last of my 4.5 minutes talking about this particular slide. What I can show you in terms of our initial findings is that we used as an indicator of the increased activity in gardening is the thinning of the woody perennial canopy. In a sense, what happens is that gardeners will go out with bush knives and manual instruments to clear pioneer vegetation to create space to garden. And if we look at this first slide, you can see up here, this is Melee study area in 2014. There is quite an abundance of woody vegetation being the dark color, we call it forest, and there's patches in between. You can see there's some gardening that's been going on in these sort of areas here. So that's just before PAM. Then just as a point of comparison in 2018, so that's 3 years after PAM, there's no really noticeable difference in the actual mixture of woody vegetation or forest area and agriculture. You have seen that there's a significant increase in the spread and the density of the two villages in question. This is Melee and then Melee Mud. And that it's reflecting of the population increase as evidenced in the demographic data. It's probably also indicative of the particularly good economic period between 2016 and 2018. So it was a great attractor for people to come into town. There are other possible explanations of that population increase, including in 2018, Ambai to the north was evacuated due to violently move. And then you can see between 2018 and 2021, there's a significant increase. You can see through here, in here, of clearing of vegetation for gardening. And you can also see that there's a slight increase in the amount of built area. Now, so why is that important? Well, the population living in these two settlements who were once are now having to find other ways to stave off extreme poverty, and that includes growing crops and other things. And there's a lot of flow-on effects that come from that, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. But the extent to which you can see these gardens is quite significant, and there's some distance that people are prepared to travel to garden as cottage. So in my 1 minute, I timed myself because I'm out of practice doing this. 1 minute and 50, maybe throw back to the audience and potentially as a discussion is what are the planning policy considerations to achieve sustainable development of the catchment? And particularly because these two photographs here, which are part of the ground truthing exercise, show that these landscapes are necessary both to house these expanding populations, but they're also necessary to provide a resource, a ready resource during disaster, to allow gardeners to be able to access them to essentially make good their opportunity to grow food during times of hardship. Or, let's hope that some of that continues to happen post-pandemic, and that it's a viable option for growing healthy and nutritious food for the population of Port Vila. So there you go. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop right there.
Oh, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a very interesting presentation. I don't see any questions from the participants as yet. So while we're waiting, I just want to ask a question in terms of your research relating to peri-urban gardening as a form of adaptation. How is it different from urban gardening that Randy Thaman has been writing about in Fiji?
So Vijay, thanks for the question. That's a good question. I think in the first instance is that these settings that I'm looking at are they're not permanently used for gardening as such. If you look at the changes over time, if there is alternative sources of income, say for example a cash economy, to me it appears that those gardens can be abandoned pretty quickly in preference to cash work. I haven't confirmed that, but that's my first initial findings. So it is a much more adaptable space in the sense that it could be used for gardening at times of disaster, but also then just be returned to bush at other times, which is probably more consistent with the way that gardening happens in rural areas anyway. And I think the second one as well is that the lack of planning, and maybe I'm not really familiar with the work in Fiji, but the lack of planning consideration really makes these potential areas kind of vulnerable, because if they're seen as sites for potential subdivisions going forward, they may solve the housing problem, but they may create another problem of vulnerability, and particularly related to the access to food during disasters.
Thank you, Andrew. Any questions from the attendees, please? I see, David, you're participating. Would you have a question then? Andrew, while we're waiting, just one other question quickly. There are implications are there implications for environmental degradation in the absence of urban planning?
Yes, I mean, look, it's interesting, Vijay, because typically I come from urban planning background in Australia, where we see significant loss of biodiversity benefits or values from urban or peri-urban development. But somewhat strangely here, we have this much more kind of cohabitation between these settlements and the urban landscape, which have been used for agriculture for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I think the bigger risks in terms of environmental degradation come from imposing kind of Western style ideas of subdivision and development onto these landscapes without considering that these people or these Nivan who potentially buy into these settlements are also going to garden. Whether they choose to do it, it might be also that they do it for necessity as well. So we just I think we need to really think about what the development typology is that's most suitable for these Pacific Island states, where you've got productive agricultural landscapes playing such an integral role in the life of the peri-urban communities, but also the economy of the towns themselves.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. There is a question on the chat box. Could be David. So can you respond to that, please?
I've got one chess question here from a friend from way back, Fed. Good day, hi Fed, how are you going? I haven't seen you for a while. But there's the sustained adoption of gardening and changes in household diet would be, I think there would be great hope amongst the community that this would be a more sustained change. But I think particularly some of the research that's been done in Port Vila showed that post-PAM, in fact, the acceleration towards imported high-density, high-calorific foods was accelerated by the introduction of food through the aid recovery system. So people shifted their diet as a result of response to disaster, and then that seems to have stuck. And I'm not sure if it's going to go back the other way. Who knows?
Thank you, and Andrew. A quick response to Professor Richard Curtin's question. Is there a difference between traditional village like Malay and migrant settlements?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Richard, one of the things that's really interesting there is that Malay is a good example of where it's become a real mix between traditional villages and migrant settlements because the rate of growth. I think probably at the level that I'm looking at, it's really, I'm only being able to make a correlation between the density of settlement. So you might have a quite dense traditional village like Malay. But what I can say is that where subdivisions have been designed to accommodate property owners' ability to garden, where the property size, the lot sizes are over 1,000 square metres, up to 2,000 square metres. You have, and this is my other side I didn't talk about when I talked about Tuma Valley, you have much less instances of opportunistic gardening in these landscapes. So, a simple act of providing enough land to garden and have a house is a
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a very interesting and well presented paper. We move on to Ramona, Boodoosingh, and Sarah Burkhart. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Vijay, and to the Pacific Update for allowing us to still come together even though we're very far apart. I'm going to start off our presentation talking a little bit about the background and the aims and the method of our research study. So our presentation this afternoon is looking at the factors affecting food choice and the food environment during COVID-19 in Samoa. As we know, the pandemic has basically upended many things. So the next slide, please, Sarah. Yeah, has upended many things, including the impacts on the food system, with more media coverage talking about increasing in food prices and impacts on the food supply chain. So in the Pacific Island countries, we've seen accompanying globalization and a shift to more cash-based economies, this reliance on imported and often highly processed foods. And coming with that, we have the risks to food security and public health. In the analysis of data gathered in 2018 for a nationally representative report, a little over a quarter of the population is estimated to experience moderate to severe food insecurity, and about 19%, close to 19%, was below the poverty line. And this is keeping in mind, this predates the impact on the tourism sector in Samoa, which decimated by measles and subsequently due to COVID-19 and closures and travel restrictions. In that data, we also had estimates of wasting, stunting, and obesity in children. Interestingly, close to 40% of the food consumed came from cereals and meat, most of it from imported food, rice and bread and chicken. And although we do have a recent study that was conducted on the impact on farmers, markets, market vendors and consumers, including Samoa and other Pacific Island countries, we didn't find any study that really spoke to specific food behaviors as a result of COVID. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the aim of our study was to try and address this gap in knowledge specifically for Samoa, looking at the perceptions of food pricing, food availability, barriers to cooking methods, foods consumed, and the uptake or shift in culturally common practices that we have here, such as bartering. And if we had any type of, as we remember seeing in the media, the bulk buying of toilet paper in in many countries if we saw an increase in bulk buying as a response to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Although the National University of Samoa has worked with the University of Sunshine Coast and Sarah's team on food choice research in the past, and we had used an observational cross-sectional design where our teams went out, and this was our initial plan, where we would go to the markets, supermarkets, bus stations, where we would have a lot of people congregating and passing through. At the time we were close to starting our data gathering exercise, we had our first recorded positive case in quarantine, which made everybody quite concerned, and we decided to have a much more conservative approach in gathering information to prevent our students moving into crowded areas. So we decided to use more of a snowball approach, where our third-year students here at the National University of Samoa School of Nursing, who had completed their research methods course, would take surveys into their communities, and community members would introduce them to other community members, so that we would be able to capture our data in that method. And we actually had a pretty good coverage of villages across Upolu and Savai'i. Two of our students served as coordinators, one in Upolu and Savai'i, so that people would just meet that one person and pass over the surveys, and then that person would come to me at the office to drop them off. Eligibility: adult residents of Samoa, able to read or speak English and Samoan. The documentation was bilingual and reviewed by nursing faculty prior to distribution. And we received ethics approval from the National University of Samoa. So the survey included several sections on demographics, looking at perception of changes to the food environment and food security before the COVID-19 emergency measures and during, and perception of the impact of COVID-19 on things such as cooking facilities and amenities, food availability, looking at different categories, including protective foods, energy, etc., barriers to cooking and or baking, consumption patterns of our different food groups, and changes to practices. So most of our questions were close-ended to make it easy for people to complete, because we knew that people were quite busy. But we did have some specific open-ended questions to capture information, such as the type of items people were buying more in bulk, the type of items people perceive the prices to have gone up or supply to have been affected. So I will pass over to Sarah, who will talk a little bit about our findings. And today we're focusing on food pricing, food availability, and food consumption. I pass over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ramona, and good afternoon, everyone. As Ramona mentioned, I'll take over the second part of the presentation and talk through some of the results. And as Ramona highlighted, we're just presenting some of those results today. We had 197 adult Samoans who participated in the survey. So we have a lot of data and we're still working our way through that. So we thought we would present what we do have and what might be of interest to people, but I guess kind of putting a note there that there is more to come with this. So just to give you an idea of our sample here, we have split it into urban population and rural populations, and we've done that based on some other categorization that has been used in the Samoan population. When we look at this in terms of whether it's representative of the Samoan population, it is quite representative of what we see in the overall population, but noting there that we've got just under 200 adults who have participated. So looking at food pricing and availability, when we asked people in general to report whether they believed that food prices had gone up, had stayed the same, or had decreased, we had 40% of people reporting that in general they thought the prices had increased. Just over 10% said that they had decreased, and 32% thought that they had remained the same. In these two figures here, you can see the differences between those regions or those groupings of location, with how many people from each of those thought that there was an increase, decrease, or it remained the same, or I'm not sure, not provided was also an option there. So quite interestingly, about 50% of those people who are based in Apia, which is an urban area, said that they thought the food prices had gone up. When we asked people about the availability of food, again, that was quite interesting. So most people believed that the availability of food had stayed the same. With the numbers there, you can see about 10% of the Apia urban population thinking that that had increased, and then the other groups, the rural groups, being quite low. So one thing that we wanted to have a look at was whether people reported changing consumption of different types of foods. And the way that we looked at this was to look at foods within the Pacific Guidelines for a Healthy Lifestyle food groups. So what we did is we asked people whether they could report back on these particular foods and whether they perceived that they had eaten about the same amount since COVID and the COVID restrictions had come into place in Samoa, or if they were eating more or less of these foods. And you can see that those results vary quite a lot looking across, these are our bodybuilding foods. But I think what's quite interesting there is you can see over 50% of people in urban locations and just on 50% of those in rural locations have reported eating more local lean meats and more local fish and seafood, which probably reflects to thinking about access to food as well. And I'll chat a little bit more about that shortly. We also looked at what is included in the protective food group. So this is our fruits and vegetables. Again, we did see some really interesting results here. If we look at the eat more, for example, if you look at the fresh fruit and the fresh vegetables, both those who are in rural and urban locations, quite a high proportion of those noted that they believe they were eating more of those particular foods post that COVID lockdown time period. Looking at energy foods, this is quite interesting too. We did see here more of the rural population saying that they were eating more roots and tubers. We did also find though here that over 50% of urban and just on 50% of people said that they were eating more rice, being white rice as well. So we can see based on these perceptions of people's, I guess what they're eating, that is changing slightly, but there's a lot of those local traditional foods somewhat being supplemented by products like the white rice. Another interesting area that we wanted to look at, namely because the evidence outside of the Pacific indicates that people tend to or have increased their consumption of these type of foods. We've called them discretionary foods because they don't have a particular name in the guidelines. But these are the type of foods that are the ultra processed foods, which are much higher in energy values, but a lot less lower in nutrient values. And we wanted to get an idea of whether people were actually eating more of these or not. And quite interestingly, you can see there with the dark grey, most people across these foods were saying that they actually ate less of them, which again might reflect that they are foods that you typically have to go to a store to purchase. And if you're not able to move around the community as much as you typically do, that might be restricting your ability to purchase these foods and consume them. But that would be something that we we want to look at in a little bit more detail, maybe by getting into some focus groups and understanding why are people not consuming more of these and why are they consuming more of some of those other foods. Just to give you an indication as well, we looked at food insecurity measures or food security measures, and these are just some of the results that we have for this. We asked a number of those FIES questions, asking people to report a response prior to COVID and then reporting if they felt that had changed during that COVID lockdown period. So you can see there, in terms of you or others in your household worrying about not having enough food to eat because of lack of money or resources, 16% of the urban population and 26% of the rural population said that yes, they did worry about that pre-COVID. But you can also see there, post-COVID, that has increased quite a lot. So up to 27% of the urban population saying yes. And 7% actually said yes more than before too. Rural's up to 30 yes and 19% yes more than before. When we looked at your household ran out of money because of ran out of food because of a lack of money or resources. Pre-COVID, that was 17% in the urban populations and 9% in the rural populations. But again, both of those have gone up during that COVID period. So I'm conscious of time and finishing off in the time that we have, but while our findings are limited in that they are self-reported, and particularly for dietary intake data, that is something we have to be somewhat careful of. What we have found, and hopefully just in those snapshots of things that we've shown today, is that COVID-19 has had some impact on food choice in Samoa. It has impacted food pricing and availability, or people's perceptions of that. It's impacted food security, and that may be linked to financial resources. And it's likely that the impact of COVID-19 has been seen slightly differently in rural versus urban populations. So as I mentioned, while we've only undertaken that preliminary analysis, we are going to be looking at some of those other associations, particularly between gender, because we know some of the work that has come from other studies has shown that there are differences in terms of diet-related change due to COVID between gender, and also household size. So with that, I will leave it there, but thank you very much to everyone for attending and listening in today. And also a special thanks to Ramona for all your work on this and presenting the first part of it. Thank you.
Sorry, very useful indicative data on food and the changes that have occurred with the COVID-19 restrictions. So we have a few 5 minutes of questions. Once again, I'm looking at the participants. Anybody got questions? So there's a question there from David Herbert in the chat box. Ramona and Sarah, do you think that these changes will be permanent, or will people revert once the pandemic is over and incomes are restored with new employment?
That's an interesting question. If people have become really accustomed to a change in a diet, and it's something that is financially affordable for their families, it may be something that might continue in the long term, but also it's really unsure how long it will take for economies to rebound from COVID, especially those that are so heavily reliant on tourism. So those are two things I think to consider moving forward to see if that change will be something that will be long-standing or temporary.
In Sarah's contribution to the paper, in presenting the paper, she implied that there were some changes that were positive. Greater reliance on tubers, root crops, and fruits and vegetables as against processed food. And this is questions around access and affordability, which I see as positive trends. What do you think about it?
I think it's very positive. When we went into lockdown and the government responded, part of that response included getting seedlings out to people to begin to plant. And a lot more people were at home. So they did have access to the seedlings and that support for planting. So if they continue to have that support, that might be something that can influence people to support home gardening. And again, it comes back to having built that habit of consuming the item and also being able to afford it. Because some of the exports of taro and so would have been affected due to transport interruptions. So those would have been redirected into the local market. So I'm unsure when transportation and shipping begins to become more regular, if that export of some of these locally available tubers will reduce the amount that will be available for the local market to consume.
Thank you very much, Ramona. Yeah. I'd like to thank you. We have run out of time for your part of the session. I'd like to thank you and Sarah for this excellent research and the findings that you've shared with us. We move on to Salesh Kumar and his paper. Salesh, is over to you.
Good afternoon, all of you. Thank you, Vijay. My name is Salesh Kumar. I'm an assistant professor at the College of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry at the Fiji National University. My fellow researcher mate is Dr. Neelesh Gounder. He's a senior lecturer at School of Economics, USP. Just to let you know, I've been doing research in the Sigatoka Valley in terms of supply chain and value chain. So a few years back, we did value chain extensive research in the Sigatoka Valley. Given COVID-19, then we thought of revisiting and coming to this topic, which is COVID-19, domestic supply chain and food security, a case study of Fiji. So we dealt with market vendors and smallholder farmers who produce for household consumption. Surplus is sold in the local and export market. So in terms of introduction, yeah, we all know apart from international supply chains, domestic supply chains for locally grown perishable food, such as vegetables, fruits, root crops, they've been impacted now in many countries, developing countries, developed countries, now due to this COVID restriction. And it has also impacted Fiji. Farmers, market vendors from rural areas were unable to supply directly to consumers in the urban centers due to the movement restriction. More complicating case is that in Fiji and many Pacific Island countries, we lack cold chains for locally grown fruits and vegetables. That's where we would expect more of disruptions and losses along the supply chains. So, impact of COVID-19 restrictions on domestic agricultural supply chains in Fiji. We have used Sigatoka Valley because in Fiji it is the main vegetable production center. And we have used Singatoka town or Singatoka municipal market as a market vendor study. So most of the agricultural produce sold in the urban areas is sourced from this large number of small farmers, and supply chain shocks can have tangible social and economic consequences on these farmers. In terms of case study, we have chosen Singatoka Valley. We have surveyed the farmers and the vendors. We collected the data from the market vendors as well as the farmers. Why we chose Singatoka Valley, as I have said, it is also called the salad bowl of Fiji. Singatoka is also one of the Fiji's main destination for foreign tourists. And hotels in Singatoka are usually referred as located in the Coral Coast, receive 20% of all the expenditure by tourists in hotels in Fiji. Hotels in the Coral Coast spend around 10 million to purchase local agricultural produce for consumption by tourists. So we can see, for instance, tourism's backward linkages with agriculture creates this possibility that any condition which impedes the growth in the tourism industry will impede the growth in the agricultural sector. In terms of survey, we are just briefing here. Figure 1 shows the domestic agriculture supply chain. It is very important to have this, so we are able to connect how the produce moves. The municipal markets, they continue to be the primary source for consumers to buy the fresh fruits and vegetables. And then the market vendors, they are largely linked to consumers as well as the farmers. In terms of sample size, we did the research in the Singatoka Valley in December 2020. This was the COVID time. So you can see that while we were able to get some vendors, we were able to just interview fewer farmers. Okay, so this at least sets a platform to see what is happening or what has been happening in terms of this COVID-19. You know, because things such as now in terms of other shocks, in terms of floods, while tourism sector was there, the people would have moved out from the flooding zone, and they had an alternative to join the tourism industry. But here in this case, we have seen what has happened to the tourism industry, and people are moving or they have been moving towards farming, urban gardening and so forth. So with these COVID restrictions, at least we have managed to interview some farmers, though the numbers are small, but as I've said, we have been working with the farmers in the valley. So we have spent some good time, one-to-one interview and trying to get the information and see what is happening in the valley, how they are selling their produce, what is happening to their income, what they are thinking in terms of moving forward, given the loss of or the closure of tourism industry at this point of time. So we shall move to the results. So in terms of farmers, figure 2 provides information regarding whom or from where the farmers normally sell their produce. So we gave them the options, and we can see that most of the farmers, they sold their produce to the middleman. So we try to get this question, what were they doing before COVID-19? before April, where were they selling the produce, and we wanted to know what they were doing during this COVID time or the time we were doing the interviews. This is important to identify the various chains through which farmers' produce is sold, which will be important in identifying the source of stocks to demand. So we can see 37% of the farmers, they sold their produce to the middlemen, the wholesalers, who in turn would sell it to the market vendors or supply to the resorts. And some farmers, 30% of farmers, they direct sell it to consumers in the municipal market. And you know how that works. We go to the markets on Fridays and Saturdays, and those farmers or those vendors selling outside, most of them are farmers. So they sell their produce on Fridays or Thursdays, Fridays, and mostly on Saturdays in the market direct to the consumers. So 30% of them do so. And farmers, they also wholesale to the market vendors during the early week. In terms of factors that most affected the farm and the farm income in the last month. So we took the data in 2020. So we asked what happened. We tried to compare the last month in 1 year, which I'll show in the next slide. So firstly, what they realized or what the farmers were saying, that the most important factor impeding their farming was a low demand for the farm produce. Why that has happened? Because the middlemen, they reduced the quantity bought from the farmers, because middlemen realized that there was no demand from the hotel and resorts, or we can say zero demand from hotel and resorts. Not only that, the closure of the tourism industry, the household income, according to farmers, according to market vendors, the household income had been negatively impacted. Okay? But there was a reduced demand for the fresh produce purchased from the municipal market. Not only that, government came in and they started supplying for urban gardening in terms of seeds. So we asked another question, the factors that most affected their farm and farm income in the last 12 months. Again, we gave them these options. The farmers said that there was low demand. Now we can see that after 1 year, they are 87% of them are saying there's low demand for the farm produce. If you see the previous slide, it was 80% in a month's time, or what was happening in a month's time. But after 12 months, farmers were saying there was low demand. 87% of them saying. So the people of Singatoga Valley also rely to the large extent on the tourism industry, as we have said, and for their incomes and for their jobs. So now when they are out of job, then they are unable to afford these fresh fruits and vegetables, or they produce their own. So let's see what happens, or what has happened, or what the market vendors are saying. We were able to get more market vendors because we had 4 enumerators, and then we had all the permission from the Singatoga municipal market. Market master was there to assist and to let market vendors know. And because they were in there, with all those COVID-19 protocols, we managed to get more market vendors than farmers. So surprisingly, now 67% of the vendors indicated that they have been impacted in a large way. They have been impacted in a large way. So as I mentioned previously, hotels and resorts, this is where the market vendors and even the farmers have been selling their produce. And then it has really affected. So vendors responding to large impacts have consistently indicated they are also losing income to more competition from additional vendors that sell outside the municipal market. So what we realized that the municipal council, they allowed farmers who used to come on Fridays and Saturdays to come any day of the week and sell outside the market. So they were given temporary stores to sell the produce there. So that's one of the things that market vendors were saying. They are unable to sell because there were more vendors. People who were, now we interviewed people who were working the tourism sector, they have resorted to being market vendors for their income source. Moving forward, in terms of market vendors, impact on reduced market operations. So we have asked them. No, they were reduced hours in terms of opening hours of the market. So if that impacted, so we can see that around 80% of the vendors interviewed responded that they have been impacted by reduced market hours. What does that mean? Reduced hours meant vendors were unable to open for longer periods of time. Majority of the vendors are full-time vendors and have stalls inside the market. So these vendors retail differently from the vendors located outside or on the roadside. And not only they were losing income, but they indicated they were unable to sell the produce which they have bought, not to retail. And then if they are unable to sell it within a day or two, then that's a loss because those produce are perishable. So in terms of some policy implications, this is a broad, as I've said, this is a preliminary research, a baseline survey, which we expect or we are thinking to expand this and get more information what has been happening,
Salesh, we're running out of time, so can you conclude quickly, please?
So in terms of policy implications, disruptions emerging from COVID-19 and the restrictions have impacted both the demand and the supply. Okay? So policymakers, we can say that they have to ensure there's a timely support to the farmers as well as the market vendors. And as I've said, COVID-19, this shock is different from what was happening or what happens in terms of natural disasters and floods. Supply has been disrupted due to the containment zone, again, due to lack of cold chains, how supplies have been, no produce have been passed from or sold at the containment zone. This could have been looked at or can be looked at in future. Food security, again, agricultural supply chains are interlinked, especially for the vulnerable households in urban areas. So policy emphasis needs to ensure that agricultural food systems continue to provide vegetables, fruits, root crops to the household. And then we have got this embedded in our SDGs that all people should have access to quality, nutritious food. And then now SDG also includes that the income of the farmers need to improve. So sorry for that, taking a bit of time, Vijay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salesh. That was a very good presentation and very useful indicative findings relating to the very important group of farmers in the Singatoka Valley who are indeed the salad bowl producers of Fiji. So thank you very much. And of course, they are directly impacted by the restrictions of travel brought about by the pandemic. So I think we have time for one question. I'm looking at the participants. Anybody want to ask a question? David, you had a remark to make earlier on. You want to reiterate that?
Yeah, sorry, Vijay. I'll speak rather than type. I can speak quicker than I can type.
Okay.
I'm very interested in the recent presentation, and I just wonder. We're talking about supply interruptions and also demand interruptions. The question that sort of comes to my mind is the people who would normally buy from the markets are clearly eating. They're still eating. Where are they getting their supplies from instead of going to the market because they're locked down or whatever? Where are they getting their supplies from? Are they eating more imported food, or do the researchers think that they are actually having they're developing their own home gardens? Because I think that's really important again for what is going to happen in the future. Is this going to have a long-term impact on the Singatoka Valley if people are cultivating their own gardens and they see that as a sustainable way of getting cheaper and better food? Will it have a long-term impact on the incomes of the farmers?
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. As I've said, this is just the initial stages of our research. So probably what you have said, we haven't touched that, how they're feeding, but we know that government have given 50,000 seedling packets around, and it is increasing. So, well, we expected that people have moved, now are doing backyard gardening, but again, as you are saying, no borders have opened up. It gives us opportunity now to go and do some interviews again and check what is happening. What's the dynamics around the food system? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Salesh. Well, participants, thank you very much for being with us. And I want to extend my special thank you to Andrew MacKenzie, Ramona Boodoosingh, Sarah Burkhart, and Salesh Kumar and his colleague Neelesh. Thank you very much. I found your presentations very clear and your findings cutting edge. And I now turn it over to Beth. Beth will conclude the session.
Thanks, Vijay, for chairing the session today, and I'll echo your thank you to the presenters as well on the panel. And to our audience, we hope that you've enjoyed the session this afternoon, and for those of you who are also on this morning for the morning session and our arts presentation. And we've got our audience here on Zoom and also our audience through the live stream on Facebook. We'll be back again tomorrow, so we hope you'll be able to join us for our sessions tomorrow for day 2 of Pacific Update, co-hosted by Development Policy Centre and the University of the South Pacific. Our sessions tomorrow, in the morning, we'll have a keynote address from Fiona Hukula, who's the gender specialist at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Our morning panel will be on the topic of gender, and that will be followed again by another Pacific Arts presentation hosted by the Oceania Centre of Arts and Culture. The afternoon session will be economics. That's at 12:30 Canberra time and 2:30 p.m. Fiji time. So we hope to see you all again tomorrow, and appreciate feedback on our online event, our first online Pacific Update. Send us an email at debpolicy@anu.edu.au, and we hope you've enjoyed our first day of Pacific Update. Thank you, everyone.